Hey, it's Dan, and in this video we're going to replace the rear brake pads on this 2010 BMW S1000RR. This job's about a 2 out of 5 for difficulty, should take you less than a half hour to finish. You'll need a few tools, so a 34mm socket for the rear axle nut, a torque wrench that goes up to 74 foot-pounds, needle nose pliers to remove the cotter pin that holds the back pin in place, a 4mm punch along with a hammer to push the pin in and out of it, a T20 bit to get to the rear brake reservoir, and finally a large flat blade screwdriver to push the pistons back into the caliper. We'll start by removing the rear wheel, which means we have to loosen up the axle nut, pull out the axle, pull off the wheel, move the chain out of the way, and then we can get access to the caliper. So this is a 34mm socket. The torque on this guy is pretty high, so I need a larger wrench to let it loose. So you got the nut and the washer. I'll set these out of the way. And now I should be able to push the axle out, which will release the back wheel, and we'll move the chain out of the way, pull the wheel out. So the trick to doing this is lift the wheel up just a little bit to remove the pressure off the axle. Lift it up as you pull. So the first thing I'll do here is remove the cap from the rear reservoir, just to make sure that the fluid doesn't overflow when I push the brake pads back in. This one's a little bit tougher to get to, so I'll use a T20 bit over here just to loosen this guy up. And this will allow me to move it just enough to get the cap off. Before I do that, I want to wipe this down, make sure that there's no dust or any dirt that falls into it. It's really important that anytime you open up any of the braking system, you don't introduce any contaminants or anything bad to get in there. And here I see that it's pretty close to a minimum level, so I actually don't think this is going to be a problem, but we'll keep an eye on it anyway. So I've loosened the cap. I'm not going to remove it yet, but I will keep an eye on it as I push the pads back in. Before we remove the old brake pads, we want to push the piston back into the caliper to make sure that there's enough space for the new pads, which will be thicker, to go around the rotor. So I'll use a screwdriver here. What you want to do is insert it right in between and then just pry it apart. So if you twist it, you'll feel the piston pushing right back in. And then you just want to give yourself as much space as you can here. Now that that's out, we're going to use a 4mm punch to push the pin all the way back. So we'll insert it through here, and the pin is going to get pushed right into here. So make sure your cotter pin is out of the way when you do this step. All it's going to take is a couple of taps from a hammer here. These guys are not in there that tight. Okay. And then at this point, the old pads should come right out. So this comes out like this. The left one comes out like this. So this is the way they're going to go back in. The hole here for the pin will be in the back. So here are my new pads. I'll just reverse the process here. So make sure that you seat this guy properly. There's a little notch for them to sit in the back, so slide it in, then push it up. Same thing with the left side, slide it up and then push it up, just like this. And then we'll reuse the same push pin here and slide it back in place. And then next up, we're going to tap it in gently. So hold the pads in place to make sure they don't fall out. I'll use my punch here just to give me a little bit more control. And then you know it's in when the cotter pin hole that's drilled through this pin is fully clear so that you can put the pin back in. So here, we'll just tap it gently. All right, and next up, I'll just push the cotter pin back in. And then I'll use the screwdriver to just gently realign the brake pads to make sure there's enough clearance here for the rotor when I put them back in. All right, and finally we're going to replace the rear wheel. Take your time with this. You're going to have to align the rear rotor with the rear brake pads. Also make sure the chain is out of the way and make sure that the sprocket in the back doesn't fall out. So take your time here and just gently work it in. I promise you it will go back in. It just can be a little tricky at times, so. Once you get the tire around the caliper here, take your time to make sure that the rotor goes right between the pads, so that's in. Make sure that the caliper is still on the rail that it has to be in. Okay, my sprocket is still good on the other side, so I'll push the wheel all the way back. Loop the chain around the sprocket. And then pull it back out. So the next tricky part is going to be to get the axle right through it. So the fatter part of the chain adjuster is going to be towards the front of the bike here. I'll just get it started this way. I know that I'll need to lift up the wheel a little bit and pull it back towards me. So let's try to align it the best that we can here. And then we'll just work it in. Okay, so that's back in. This would also be a great time to make sure that your chain tension is where you need it to be. I know that mine is okay, so I can skip this step. I just did the adjustment. So right now, just make sure that the wheel is properly aligned, and then we'll just reinstall the rear axle nut and then torque it to the right spec. All right, so the torque spec for the rear axle nut is about 74 foot-pounds, and it's going to use a 34mm nut. So I've got my torque wrench set up already. We're going to install the washer followed by the nut here. So always start this by hand, and we'll torque it. And finally, the last step here is going to be to double check the brake fluid level on the rear reservoir. In my case, it looks okay. I'm going to end up flushing this anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the screw here. So this is using a Torx 20-bit. So make sure the cap is back on. Start this by hand. And we'll just snug it up. And finally, you want to work the rear brake a few times to push the pads and seat them back on. And then double check the fluid level to make sure it's still correct. In my case, it's still fine. And a quick tip, anytime you change any of your brake pads, really on any motorcycles or even cars, you want to make sure that you seat them in properly. That means doing a couple of quick steps in a controlled environment to make sure that they're bedded in and mated to the rotors. Also keep in mind that your braking performance on the new pads might be a little bit different than the old ones, so take your time with it, be careful until you get to learn to do it. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.